It is another Canucks panel time with Iain MacIntyre and Satiar Shah. And guys, the Judd Brackett situation is coming to an end. He will no longer be with the Canucks after his contract expires. So it has been a big story in this market for most of the season. On a scale of 1 to 10, and I'll start with you, Sat, how big of a story is this for the Vancouver Canucks?
It's a sliding scale, right? Like if everything was equal, it'd probably be a 7. But because of the vacuum of information and what's going on right now, it's probably at a 9, 9.5 with how it's being perceived in the market. But as you mentioned before, and Ian's mentioned this as well, Murph, this was a story during the season when it was talked about and fans cared about. So it's not like it just kind of came up when games had been stopped and it became this, outside storyline. It has been something percolating. I'd say it's a 7 that's been turned up to a 9 based on what's going on. It is an important story because the Canucks have done a good job drafting. And one of the things we've talked about is how well the drafting had been working together with management and getting stuff done. And it is disappointing that after years of success in the draft, that the managerial side couldn't stay aligned and be on the same page. And to me, that overall failing with everybody involved is very disappointing.
Yeah, I guess the classic definition of news is man bites dog. And this is very much dog biting man, because I think we all saw how this was going. It would have been naive for anybody to think that the Canucks and Judd Brackett were suddenly going to be able to mend the relationship after it had been fractured for so many months. So the story itself was not a surprise that he's actually leaving the organization. But it is still a significant story. And no matter which side you're on, and there's certainly a lot of champions for Judd Brackett out there, and understandably so, not so many champions for Jim Benning, but there are people who say, look, this is how hockey teams operate. There is a chain of command that everybody is subject to. No matter where you are in that argument, there's no doubt that this is disappointing for the Canucks, because this does end what has been the best stretch of a director of amateur scouting that the team has had. So it is a significant story.
Iain, you mentioned chain of command, and I'll ask you, Sat. Benning mentioned that Judd wanted autonomy over to make the final decision, and that's where the disagreement was. Do you believe it to be as clean as that?
I think this is far more nuanced. I mean, we've heard the side from, the outside perspective of autonomy being an issue, collaboration being an issue from the scouting director side of things, or at least within the scouting department. And you hear Jim Benning saying, well, the issue wasn't so much that, it's more about apparently Judd wanted control of things that he wasn't ready to cede. From what I understand, the issue wasn't to do with the draft list. I don't think that's been an issue from a scouting perspective. Those disagreements and building the draft board, that isn't the crux of the situation. Now, there's a side to both of these, right? Because the one sense you're getting from the scouting director's side is that he's been excluded from a lot of the big decision-making and the philosophical side of the process over the past 6 to 9 months. And, Jim Benning is making it seem like, well, no, he thinks that he wanted things above and beyond what was going on. So it comes down to what you believe of these two. But it's very clear that philosophically about how the managerial process should go, these guys couldn't agree upon it. Now, we can sit here and say it's Judd's fault. We can sit here and say it's Jim's fault. But it's very clear they have very different visions of how collaboration would work and how the management side should be structuring that entire process. And that is a crux of the issue, not so much disagreeing about who should get drafted and who should be above who on the draft list.
Yeah, I really don't think the issue was a lack of collaboration. If anything, there was probably too much collaboration, at least for Judd Brackett's liking, because he clearly wanted more autonomy than, as you say, Sat, than what Benning was willing to give up. And you're right, there's going to be a lot of layers to this. There's no getting around, though, that it is disappointing. And it also leaves the Canucks in an uncomfortable position where they have a draft a couple of months away. We don't know exactly when. Maybe it'll be in September. Where they no longer have their director of amateur scouting, who contractually is now going to be able to go and work for another team for this very draft. So there's a lot riding on this today for the Canucks. It's not going to be a quick assessment of what the actual cost is, because we're probably going to have to wait a couple of years. But I think there was always that faint hope, maybe not so much the last month, but there had been a faint hope that because things had gone so well for both sides, that this was a relationship that they should try to salvage. It never really came close to that, though.
Be interesting to see if Judd Brackett speaks. I'm not sure he will, but to hear his side of the story. Okay, guys, let's move on. We've heard Gary Bettman talk about phase 1 and phase 2 of this return to play. I want to talk about phase 3 and training camp. Do you see a scenario in which Vancouver does not host its own training camp for the Canucks?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because the 14-day quarantine, I think we've all known that this is going to be an issue as far as the Canadian cities, Toronto, Edmonton, Vancouver, being a candidate to be a hub city for whenever these playoffs return. But that 14-day quarantine also has a direct effect on preparation for what's going to be a really grueling and important training camp if the NHL gets to that stage. And so when you're looking at it from the player's perspective, so 14 days of quarantine, so they can either prepare in Sweden or wherever they are in the US or in Canada in small groups and get ready for training camp, or for half of the roster that's outside of Canada right now on the Canucks, they come back here and they prepare by doing push-ups in their apartment for 2 weeks. That's not a very appealing preparation. And so understandably, the Canucks, and I'm sure the other Canadian teams in the playoffs, are now looking at, is it better if the NHL decides that Canada's not going to be a hub, have a hub city, is it better just to go to the US and have the training camp there? And very much yes, it probably is logistically for preparation better to do that. But there is still a lot of negotiation going on between the league and the Prime Minister's office. And we know that provincial officials are starting to get involved as well, especially in Alberta. And so I think we're a ways yet from knowing how this is going to go.
Okay, then I'll go the last question then to you, Sat. I'm guessing it's far-fetched then to believe that a Canadian city, including Vancouver, will be a hub city, especially with what we know at this point. A lot can change in 6 weeks, but at this point, it looks a little far-fetched.
Right now, it certainly does. I did find it interesting, though, seeing what came out of Alberta and their health experts coming up with, I wouldn't say loopholes to get around the 14-day quarantine, but to be able to execute it differently by having a couple teams together that can actually play each other. So there are ways to get around that whole aspect, but it comes down to the testing capacity as well and being able to do that. And so right now it doesn't look like it, but one thing I did find really interesting, hearing from players and hearing from managers over the past few days, they keep saying, what are things going to be like in a few weeks? What could it be like in 3 weeks or 4 weeks? So one of the reasons they haven't committed to a site yet is if things continue to progress positively, some of those restrictions may be lifted in a few weeks. And all of a sudden, that may take away some of those concerns. Right now, I agree with you, Murph. It doesn't look like Canada is going to have a hub city. But as we move forward a couple of weeks here, we could see that change. And I think the big reason why the NHL is keeping it open-ended as opposed to making a strict call on when they're going to name a hub city is to see if they can come to some sort of an agreement with more relaxed measures if things continue to progress positively with the pandemic.
And one last thought on that, Murph. I know you think I talk too much, but I'll be brief, I promise. People have to remember that this is the player's choice, how they prepare for training camp. The teams don't have the authority to tell them now at the end of May, you must report back to your NHL city, even if that means sitting in your apartment for 2 weeks. And that's why I think a lot of players obviously are waiting to see how this goes before deciding where their next flight is going to be to.
All right. I don't think you talk too much. I know you talk too much, and that's why we have the beauty of editing. Boys, thanks for joining me. And Sat. Yeah. We'll talk again soon, all right?
Thanks, boys.